Senator Hagerty.
Thank you. Let me get my microphone on here. Mr. Keating, can I stay with you, please? I want to talk about the chilling effects of donor disclosure that actually occur under the DISCLOSE Act. As I understand it, the DISCLOSE Act would require groups engaged in political speech, like nonprofit groups, to disclose the names and addresses of their significant donors and their administrators. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then what would be the likely effect of requiring nonprofits and other groups to disclose the names and addresses of their supporters as this unfolds?
Well, look, I think for the popular groups, they probably won't have much impact if they are concentrated in a particular geographic location. But even there, they may see an impact. But I think for many, many groups, what we will see is groups will choose perhaps a combination of two different things. One is their public communications will become far less effective because they won't inform people who their members of Congress are or their senators, to call on them to take action, whether it's, passing something to restore abortion rights or to advocate for lower taxes, whatever issue it may be. And so they'll either make their communications less effective, or what they'll find is they'll find that donors are just simply not going to be willing to give money. Now, we're not talking here, as Senator King mentioned, where do we draw the line? The answer is, I think, the Supreme Court drew the line. The line is when you're expressly advocating for a candidate or against a candidate, urging the election or defeat of a candidate, that's where the line should be drawn. And I think that when groups are advocating on policy for social change, for improving the United States through passing legislation or repealing bad laws, we have to protect the people that are advocating for these changes that are not the majority view yet. And that's why this bill is so overreaching in its impact. That's why the ACLU has expressed concerns. That's why the Alliance for Justice has expressed concerns. There's a lot of concern about this across the spectrum. A lot of the liberal groups, unfortunately, are not willing to speak out on this. But I can tell you that a number of them are quite concerned about this legislation.
Well, some of the aspects of the legislation I'd like to dig into a little bit more closely, because the regulations themselves, I think, that would come from this legislation can be confusing and chill speech. First, I'd like to go to the PASO standard that determines whether the speech promotes, attacks, supports, or opposes the figure that's being either criticized or talked about, which is vague. It's impossible to objectively administer. Think about the deceptive and coercive requirements like forcing groups to declare whether they support or oppose public officials, even if they do neither. And you think about the oppressive disclosure requirements that are required in order to even engage in political speech. You went through an example where 18 seconds of a 30-second ad would be eaten up just to meet the disclosure requirements. Wholly impractical. Let's take another example. We could take another real-life scenario like the one you proposed. But let's assume that a nonprofit, nonpartisan group were to spend $15,000 to run just 15-second local television ads urging their senators to do more to stand up for crime victims and tougher sentences for violent criminals. And let's say the group's funded mostly by family members of violent crime victims. Some of them may have made donations more than $10,000. Such an ad might be determined to fall under the new definition of applicable public communication, which incorporates the vague PASO standard. Is that correct?
Absolutely. That's definitely correct.
And if it's considered an applicable public communication, then this nonprofit group would have to declare whether it supports or opposes the senators it mentions, even if it doesn't in fact support or oppose them, and instead is just advocating for crime victims. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. I mean, I think one of the problems with this legislation is it would force organizations and the federal government to publish misinformation. We've heard a lot of concern publicly about misinformation, including from this body in the Senate, the U.S. Senate, about misinformation. And here's a piece of legislation requiring groups to report misinformation on public forums, which would then be carried by the media. And that's not the only element of misinformation. A lot of donors, so-called donors that would be reported and associated with these ads, in fact, had never seen the ads, may not agree with the ads, but yet would be either published on the face of the ad itself or in public reports saying they financed it, which would be totally false in some instances.
It's very troublesome. Thank you, Mr. Keating.
Thank you very much.